The classroom was quiet, except for the faint hum of the old ceiling fan. The sun slipped through the dusty windows, painting golden lines across the floor. In the corner of that almost forgotten room stood a piano, old, cracked, and covered with a sheet that had turned gray with age. Most people didn't even notice it anymore. To them, it was just a broken piece of furniture that belonged to another time. But to one girl, that piano was something else, something special. She was the kind of person who could walk through a crowded hallway and barely be seen. Her teachers said she was polite but quiet. Her classmates didn't pay much attention to her. She sat in the last row, took her notes, and always left the room before anyone could start a conversation. Nobody really knew what she did after school, and she liked it that way. One afternoon, she stayed back to help her teacher clean up after class. Everyone else had already left, their laughter echoing down the hallway. As she swept near the corner of the room, her broom hit something hard under the sheet. When she pulled it back, she saw the piano for the first time. Its wood was chipped, a few keys were missing, and the strings inside looked rusty. But when she pressed one of the remaining keys, a soft sound escaped. Fragile but beautiful. She pressed another key. Then another. The sound was uneven, yet there was something about it that felt warm. It reminded her of something she couldn't name. Maybe peace, maybe freedom. She didn't know much about music, but she liked the feeling that came with those sounds. When she left that day, she looked back at the piano and smiled. Something inside her whispered that she would be back. From that day on, she began staying after school. She waited until the halls were empty, until the voices faded and the classrooms went dark. Then she would slip into the old room, uncover the piano, and play. At first, she didn't know what she was doing. She pressed keys randomly, listening to the sounds they made. Sometimes it sounded terrible, but she didn't care. She kept trying. Every day her fingers moved a little faster. Every day her ear caught something new. She didn't have lessons or books. All she had was her curiosity and patience. She began to hum small tunes she heard in movies or on the radio, then tried to copy them on the piano. It took her hours, sometimes days, but she slowly started to play melodies that made sense. Her fingers found their own way. She learned how soft notes could sound like whispers and how strong ones could speak like thunder. The old piano had become her secret friend, the only one that truly understood her silence. Weeks passed, then months. She became so used to her secret routine that she couldn't imagine a day without it. Sometimes she forgot to eat dinner because she was too lost in sound. Her parents thought she was studying in the library. They had no idea that their quiet daughter was teaching herself music in an abandoned classroom. Her connection with the piano deepened. When she was sad, she played slowly, each note heavy like raindrops. When she was happy, her fingers danced across the keys. The piano listened every time. It never interrupted, never judged. It became her voice when she couldn't find the right words. One rainy afternoon, the principal came to inspect the classrooms. The girl panicked when she heard footsteps in the hallway. She quickly threw the sheet over the piano and hid behind a table. The principal peeked into the room, saw the old instrument, shook his head, and muttered something about having it removed one day. After he left, she exhaled deeply. The thought of losing the piano scared her more than anything else. That day, she promised herself she would never let that happen. The next morning, she came early and cleaned it carefully. She polished the keys, tightened loose screws, and tried fixing the pedals with tape and string. It wasn't perfect, but it looked better. She ran her hand gently across the keys and whispered, "You're safe now." From that day, she cared for it like it was alive. One day during lunch break, a sound escaped from the room as she played without realizing the door was open. A student walking by heard it and peeked in. He watched quietly, surprised by how naturally she moved her hands across the keys. When she noticed him, she froze. Her fingers stopped midair and her face turned pale. He quickly said, "That was beautiful," and left before she could reply. She didn't tell anyone about it, but deep down it made her heart warm. Maybe her music wasn't just for her anymore. A few weeks later, the school announced a music competition. It was the first one in years. Students could sign up to perform in front of judges from different schools. Everyone was excited. Some students began rehearsing guitar songs. Others practiced singing. She stood near the notice board and read the announcement quietly. Her heart started beating faster. She wanted to join, but she also knew how people saw her. Too quiet, too invisible. Still, that small voice inside her whispered again, Try. That afternoon, she took the form, filled it out, and placed it on the teacher's desk. Nobody noticed at first, but when the list of names went up on the wall, her classmates laughed. She's performing? She can't even talk loud enough in class, one of them joked. She heard the laughter but didn't react. She simply turned away and walked down the hall. She had been laughed at before. It no longer hurt the same way. The music teacher, a middle-aged man with a sharp tone, noticed her name on the list and raised an eyebrow. He didn't remember ever hearing her play. The next day he called her after class. "You've signed up for the piano category," he said. "Have you been trained somewhere?" She shook her head. "No, sir." He looked surprised. "All right then," he continued, "let's hear something. Play the simplest tune you know." Her heart raced as she sat down at the piano in the music room. Not her piano, but a different one that felt cold and unfamiliar. She placed her fingers on the keys and began playing a small children's tune, the first thing she had ever learned by herself. It was "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." The teacher listened for a few seconds, then sighed lightly. "You have a good touch," he said, "but that's a very basic piece. Maybe you should play this same one at the competition. It's easy and safe." She nodded without saying anything. Inside she felt something stir, not anger but determination. She had played that simple tune for years, but in her world it wasn't simple anymore. She had changed it, shaped it, turned it into something entirely new. She had played it hundreds of times, sometimes softly, sometimes powerfully, sometimes as if it were a lullaby, other times like a storm. But she didn't tell him that. She just smiled politely and said, "Okay, sir." As she walked home that day, the sound of raindrops on rooftops reminded her of piano keys. She thought about the competition, the bright lights, the judges, the laughter of her classmates. The idea of playing in front of so many people terrified her, yet she couldn't ignore the small spark in her chest. She wanted to show them what music meant to her, not for applause or attention, but because she wanted to share the feeling that had lived quietly inside her for so long. The next few weeks became her secret preparation. Every evening, she went back to her old classroom, locked the door, and sat at her piano. She didn't practice the simple version of the song. Instead, she began building her own version. She slowed it down, added layers of emotion, changed the rhythm, and let her feelings guide her hands. Sometimes she closed her eyes and imagined stars falling across a dark sky. Other times, she imagined the sound of her heart when she felt lonely. Every note came from somewhere deep inside. Her version didn't sound like a child's song anymore. It sounded like a story. There were days when she got frustrated. The piano's keys would stick, the sound would break, or she'd forget how a part went. But she never gave up. The room would get darker and she'd still be there, practicing by the faint light from the window. The old clock on the wall would tick softly as her fingers kept moving. Her body would ache, but her soul felt alive. On the night before the competition, she sat at the piano for the last time that week. The moonlight came through the window and touched the keys, making them shine faintly. She took a deep breath and began to play her final version. The melody filled the room, gentle, sad, and beautiful. When she finished, she sat in silence for a while, tears resting quietly in her eyes. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she knew she had given everything she had to the music. She covered the piano with its sheet again, but before leaving, she whispered softly, "Thank you." Then she walked out into the cool night, the echo of her music following her down the hallway. At home, she couldn't sleep. She kept hearing the melody in her mind. Her hands moved slightly as if she were still playing. Her parents wished her good night, not knowing that the next day would change their daughter's life forever. Morning came, bright and busy. The school auditorium was decorated with colorful banners and rows of chairs. Students tuned their instruments, teachers checked sound systems, and parents filled the seats. Backstage, she waited quietly, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. Her classmates whispered nearby, some amused, some curious, but she stayed calm, holding on to the same thought that kept her going every day. Just play. When her name was called, she took a slow breath and walked to the stage. The piano stood under the spotlight, shining like something from a dream. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed her trembling hands on the keys. The judges leaned back, expecting a beginner's performance. The audience prepared to hear something simple, maybe even ordinary. But as she looked at the keys, she remembered all those quiet evenings. The dust, the broken strings, the silence that became her teacher. She closed her eyes for a second, let the air settle, and began to play the very first note. It was soft, but it carried everything she had ever felt. And though no one knew it yet, what was about to happen would leave the entire hall in complete stillness. The sound of the first note hung in the air like a whisper. It was soft and gentle, but there was something in it that made people look up. The judges, who had been glancing at their papers a moment before, now turned their eyes to the stage. The audience, full of students and parents, went quiet. Nobody had expected much from her. They thought it would be a small, easy tune, something simple to fill the time. But the moment she pressed the second note, something changed. She didn't rush. Her fingers moved slowly, carefully, as if she were telling a story only she understood. The simple tune everyone knew, the one that was supposed to be childish and ordinary, sounded different in her hands. It was soft but deep. Each note had emotion behind it, as if she had hidden her feelings inside the keys. The melody began to shift, stretching and twisting into something unexpected. The judges leaned forward slightly. One of them frowned, not in confusion but in concentration. The teacher who had told her to play the simple piece sat in the front row, his arms crossed at first, but slowly his expression began to change. The sound that filled the hall didn't belong to an untrained student. It belonged to someone who felt every part of what she played. The audience stayed still. Even the ones who had laughed at her before now sat quietly, eyes wide. Nobody had seen her practice. Nobody had ever heard her play, and now under the stage lights it was like she had become someone else entirely. As she played, she forgot about everyone around her. The lights, the crowd, the judges, and they all disappeared. She wasn't on a stage anymore. In her mind, she was back in that old classroom with the broken piano. She could almost smell the dust, feel the rough wood under her fingers. The memory gave her comfort. Every note reminded her of the nights she had spent alone, teaching herself one mistake at a time. Her hands moved faster now. The melody grew stronger, rising and falling like waves. The audience didn't understand how she was doing it, how such a simple tune could sound so powerful, so full of meaning. Some people even forgot to breathe for a few seconds. It wasn't just music. It was emotion turned into sound. When she reached the middle part of her performance, she slowed down again. The notes turned soft, almost like a lullaby. There was something sad in the way she played, something that made people feel quiet inside. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was real. It was honest. She played as if she was talking to herself through the piano, and somehow everyone in that hall could feel it too. The judges exchanged glances. One of them took off his glasses and leaned forward. Another whispered something under his breath. The teacher who had doubted her now sat completely still, his mouth slightly open. The girl who had been invisible for so long was now the only thing anyone could see. When the last note came, it didn't end sharply. It faded away gently like a sigh at the end of a long day. Then there was silence, real silence. Not a single sound in the entire hall. She kept her head down, her hands resting on the keys, afraid to move. She didn't know what to expect. For a few seconds she thought maybe she had done something wrong, but then slowly someone began clapping, then another person, and another. Within moments the sound of applause filled the room. It was loud, warm, and full of surprise. People stood up from their seats cheering for her. The sound echoed through the hall, and for the first time she smiled. Not a big smile, but a small, quiet one. She stood, gave a small bow, and left the stage. As she walked backstage, her hands trembled. She couldn't believe what had just happened. She didn't care about winning or losing. The fact that people listened, really listened, meant everything. Behind the curtain, the teacher approached her. His expression had softened. "That," he said quietly, "was not what I expected." She looked down, unsure how to respond. "You played that piece like it was your own," he continued. She nodded slightly. "It was," she said softly, almost a whisper. He looked at her, surprised by her words, and simply nodded back. She sat on a wooden bench near the wall, trying to calm her heartbeat. Other performers passed by, guitar players, singers, violinists, but she barely noticed them. She could still hear her own notes echoing in her mind. For the first time, she didn't feel invisible. Later that afternoon, when all the performances were over, the judges gathered to discuss the results. The students waited anxiously in the audience. The girl sat in the back row, her fingers still fidgeting. She wasn't nervous about the award. She had already received something far more valuable. The moment when the entire hall listened to her without laughing, without judging, without expecting anything. When the host returned to the stage with the results, everyone leaned forward. The smaller categories were announced first. Best vocal performance, best instrumental group, best composition. Finally, the host said, "And now for the solo piano category." The room grew quiet again. The host smiled and looked at the paper. "First place goes to..." He paused, drawing out the suspense. "Our very own quiet genius and the one who turned the simplest melody into magic." The audience erupted again. She froze for a moment, unsure what to do. The teacher behind her nudged her gently. "Go," he whispered. She stood slowly, almost in disbelief, and walked toward the stage. The clapping grew louder as she took the small golden trophy from the judge's hand. One of the judges, an older man with kind eyes, leaned close and said, "You have a gift, young lady." "Don't stop here." She nodded shyly, unable to find her words. The teacher clapped the hardest, his pride showing openly. That night she went home holding the small trophy in her hands. Her parents greeted her at the door, surprised to see the shiny award. Her mother's eyes filled with tears when she heard what had happened. "You never told us you could play," she said softly. The girl just smiled. "I didn't know I could," she replied. They placed the trophy on the living room shelf, but she couldn't stop thinking about the old classroom piano. Her piano. That was where it all began. After dinner, when everyone had gone to bed, she quietly slipped out of the house and walked back to school. The moon was bright and the cool air brushed against her face. She entered the empty building and made her way to the classroom. The door creaked as she pushed it open. The piano sat there just as she had left it. She lifted the sheet and sat down. The keys felt familiar under her fingers. She smiled and began to play the same melody she had performed earlier, the one that had changed everything. But this time, it wasn't for judges or applause. It was just for her and the piano. The notes sounded softer, more peaceful. It was like talking to an old friend after a long day. When she finished, she rested her hand on the keys and whispered, "We did it." Over the next few weeks, things began to change. People at school started talking to her. Some wanted to know how she learned to play. Others just wanted to hear her perform again. She wasn't used to the attention, but she tried to stay the same, quiet, polite, and focused. The teacher began giving her extra time in the music room. He even helped her tune the old piano and promised to ask the principal not to remove it. "You brought this piano back to life," he said one day as he cleaned the keys with her. She looked at him and smiled. "Maybe it brought me to life first," she said quietly. Soon she was asked to perform again, this time at a small local event. She hesitated at first, but the teacher encouraged her. "People need to hear what you can do," he said. "Music like yours doesn't come often." She finally agreed. At the event, she wore a simple white dress and sat at the piano calmly. The lights felt less scary now. When she played, the audience fell silent again, just like before. Even the children stopped whispering. After she finished, the same warm applause filled the room. A few people even came to talk to her afterward, saying her music made them feel calm and emotional at the same time. That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened. A few months ago, she was just the quiet girl who cleaned classrooms and played alone. Now people called her talented. Some even used the word genius. But deep down, she didn't see herself that way. She just saw someone who loved music so much that she couldn't keep it inside anymore. One evening, the teacher called her to his office. On his desk was a letter. He handed it to her and said, "Open it." She unfolded it slowly and began to read. It was an invitation from a regional music academy. They had heard about her performance and wanted to offer her a chance to attend a special training program. She looked up in shock, but "I never applied," she said. The teacher smiled. "I sent them a recording from the competition. They want to see what you can do." She didn't know what to say. It felt unreal. "You have something rare," he continued. "Don't let it fade. Keep playing no matter what." She nodded, holding the letter tightly in her hands. That night, she went to her old piano once again. The moonlight fell softly across the dusty floor. She sat down, closed her eyes, and began to play a new melody, something she had never played before. It was gentle but hopeful, full of promise. She didn't know what the future would bring. She didn't know if she would ever become famous or if people would remember her name. But she knew one thing for sure. As long as she had a piano and a melody in her heart, she would never be alone again. And somewhere deep inside, the same quiet voice that once told her to try whispered once more, "This is only the beginning." The morning air carried a strange mix of nerves and excitement. She woke up earlier than usual, unable to sleep any longer. The letter from the music academy lay on her desk, its edges slightly wrinkled from how many times she had held it. Every time she read the words, it felt unreal, like a dream that might disappear if she blinked too hard. The invitation said she had been selected to attend a youth music camp for 2 weeks. It wasn't a competition. It was a learning program where talented students from different schools would come together. They would train under real musicians and composers, people who performed on real stages, the kind she had only seen on television. She looked at her old piano in the corner of her room, the small keyboard her teacher had helped her borrow for practice. It wasn't the same as the one at school, but the keys felt familiar enough. She touched them softly, playing the first few notes of her song. It made her smile. Her parents had been proud when they found out. Her mother had hugged her tightly, saying, "You've made us proud just by being yourself." Her father didn't say much, but every now and then, she caught him smiling when he thought she wasn't looking. On the first day of the program, she wore a simple blue dress and tied her hair neatly. The academy was bigger than she had imagined. The walls were covered with photographs of famous pianists, and the halls echoed with sounds of music, violins, flutes, guitars, and pianos playing all at once. It felt like walking into another world. A woman in glasses greeted her warmly at the entrance and gave her a name tag. "You'll be in Group C," she said. "Your instructor will meet you shortly." The girl nodded quietly, holding her small notebook close. When she entered the large rehearsal room, she noticed other students already gathered around the piano. Some of them looked confident, chatting with each other, showing off small pieces they had written. She stood near the back, feeling that old sense of shyness return. She wondered if they could tell that she had never taken formal lessons before. The instructor arrived soon after, a tall man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Good morning, everyone," he said. "I'm very excited to hear each of you play. Remember, this isn't about who's best. It's about finding what music means to you." One by one, the students took turns playing. Some performed classical pieces, others original compositions. When it was her turn, she walked slowly to the piano, her heart pounding so hard she could almost hear it. "What will you play for us?" the instructor asked. She thought for a second, then said softly, "Something simple." She sat down and began playing the same melody she had played at the competition, the one that had changed everything. The room fell silent as soon as her fingers touched the keys. Even among trained students, her playing felt different. It wasn't perfect, but it was full of feeling. Her hands moved naturally, her eyes half closed, lost in the world of sound. When she finished, there was a pause. Then the instructor smiled. "Beautiful," he said. "You don't play with technique. You play with heart. That's something we can't teach." The other students looked at her differently after that. They asked her how long she had been playing, which school she came from, who her teacher was. She didn't know how to answer. "I just practiced," she said quietly. Over the next few days, the program became a blur of lessons, rehearsals, and small performances. She learned new techniques, new chords, and how to read more complex sheet music. But the best moments came late at night, when she stayed in the practice room after everyone had left. She would sit at the piano alone and play for hours, just like she used to in her school's empty classroom. Sometimes the instructor would walk by and listen quietly from the hallway. He didn't interrupt. He just smiled to himself, realizing he was witnessing something rare, raw, natural talent shaped not by rules, but by emotion. One afternoon near the end of the camp, the academy director announced a small showcase. Each student would perform one piece in front of visiting guests, including a few local journalists and musicians. The instructor approached her after class and said, "You should play something original. Play what only you can play." That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by her window staring at the moon, thinking about what he had said. "Something only I can play," she whispered. Her mind wandered back to the old classroom, to the broken piano, to the way it sounded when the rain hit the windows. Slowly, she began humming a new melody. The next few days were filled with quiet work. She wrote small pieces in her notebook, crossed them out, and tried again. She didn't use fancy notes or complicated patterns, just feelings turned into sound. When she finally played it from start to finish, she smiled. It felt like her. The day of the showcase arrived. The auditorium at the academy was full. Families, teachers, and guests filled the seats. The air buzzed with chatter and nervous laughter. She sat backstage, her hands cold, clutching her small notebook. When her turn came, the host announced her name and said, "This young pianist will be performing her own original piece." She walked to the stage slowly. The lights were bright, just like before. She took a deep breath, sat down, and placed her fingers on the keys. The first note echoed through the room. It was soft, delicate, the beginning of her new melody. She built it slowly, layer by layer. The audience leaned in, drawn by the emotion in every sound. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it felt alive. It was a song about growing, about finding light in quiet places. The judges and guests exchanged glances. Some of them whispered to each other, recognizing the depth in her playing. When she finished, there was a short silence, that same kind of silence she had once felt in her school hall. Then the applause came, steady and warm. After the performance, several people came to speak with her. One of them was a well-known pianist who had performed internationally. "That was beautiful," he said. "You have something rare, an instinct for emotion. Don't lose it." The Academy director also congratulated her. "You remind me of why music exists," he said kindly. Not to impress, but to express. When she returned home after the camp, things felt different. The world seemed a little bigger now. She carried her new notebook filled with handwritten music and ideas. The teacher at her school welcomed her back with a smile and said, "So, how was it?" She handed him the notebook. He flipped through it, eyes widening. "You wrote all this?" She nodded. "It's not perfect," she said quietly, "but it's mine." He looked at her proudly. "Then it's already perfect," he said. Over the next few months, she began composing more often. She still practiced in the old classroom after school, but now sometimes other students came to listen. They sat on the floor quietly watching as she played. She didn't mind anymore. In fact, it made her happy to share her music with others. One day, a local newspaper ran a story about her. The girl who taught herself piano. The article talked about her first competition, the academy invitation, and how she had never taken formal lessons before. People from nearby schools came just to see her play. Some teachers invited her to perform at their events. She was shy about it at first, but every time she touched the piano, all the fear disappeared. It wasn't about attention or fame. It was about that same feeling she had the first time she touched those dusty keys. Peace. Her parents often sat together at the back of the hall whenever she performed. They didn't always understand the music, but they could see how alive she looked when she played. Her father once said softly, "It's like she speaks through those keys." One evening, her teacher told her about a bigger competition coming up in the city. It was a national event where young pianists from across the country would perform. He encouraged her to try. She hesitated, unsure if she was ready for such a big stage. But that small voice inside her, the same one that had pushed her to try the first time, spoke again. "You've come this far. Don't stop now." The following weeks were filled with long hours of practice. She used the old piano at school during the day and her small keyboard at night. Sometimes her fingers hurt, but she didn't stop. She wanted to do something special, not just for the judges, but for herself, for the piano that had started it all, and for the people who believed in her. The day of the national competition came faster than she expected. The city auditorium was much larger than anything she had ever seen. The audience stretched far into the shadows. As she stood backstage, she could hear the faint sound of other contestants performing. Fast, complicated pieces full of skill and precision. For a moment, she felt small again, like the quiet girl no one noticed. Then she remembered the words her instructor had told her. Don't play to impress. Play to express. When her name was called, she stepped onto the stage. The bright lights made it hard to see the faces in the crowd. She sat down, placed her fingers gently on the keys, and let the music begin. She didn't play something showy or fast. She played her own piece, and slow, emotional, honest. It told a story without words. The hall filled with the sound of her heart. every note a piece of her journey. When the final note faded, there was silence once more. The same kind of silence that had followed her every time she played from her heart. She looked up, her hands trembling slightly, and saw the judges staring at her, moved. The applause came again, louder this time, filling the vast room. Backstage, one of the judges approached her. He was the same pianist who had praised her at the Academy showcase. "You've grown," he said with a smile. "I told you not to lose your heart. You didn't." That night, as she rode home in the car with her parents, the city lights blurred outside the window. She rested her head against the glass, tired but happy. She didn't know what the results would be. It didn't matter. She had played honestly. She had shared her story, and in her heart, she knew this was just another step, not the end. The world was finally beginning to hear the quiet girl who once played alone in a forgotten classroom. When she returned from the national competition, the first thing she wanted to do was rest. Her hands were tired, her heart was full, and her mind still echoed with the sound of the grand piano she had played on. The stage, the lights, the applause, it all felt like a dream she didn't want to wake from. At home, things went back to normal, but something inside her had changed. Every time she walked past her small piano, she smiled. It wasn't just an instrument anymore. It was like an old friend who had walked with her through everything, through doubt, through hope, through the quiet moments that no one else had seen. Her parents noticed the difference too. She spoke more confidently now, carried herself with quiet pride, and when she played, her music had even more feeling. It was no longer a hobby. It had become a part of who she was. A week later, a letter arrived from the competition committee. Her father opened it carefully while her mother waited beside him. The paper trembled in his hands as he read aloud. She had won second place in her category. It wasn't the first prize, but it didn't matter. For someone who had taught herself, who had played on a broken piano and learned by ear, it was an incredible achievement. When she heard the news, she just smiled and said softly, "That's more than I ever dreamed." The next morning, something unexpected happened. A local radio station called the school, asking if they could interview her. They said they had read about her journey in the newspaper and wanted to share her story with listeners. Her teacher agreed immediately. The interview was simple and warm. The host asked her how she started learning piano, who inspired her, and what her dreams were. She spoke slowly, choosing her words carefully. "I just wanted to understand the music," she said. "Every time I played, it made me feel calm. Like everything around me made sense for a moment." The interview spread quickly. People loved her honesty and humility. Some said her story reminded them of their own dreams they had once given up on. Others wrote letters to the station saying how her story gave them hope. Within a few weeks, she was invited to perform at a charity concert organized by a local cultural center. The concert was meant to raise funds for children who wanted to learn music, but couldn't afford instruments or lessons. When she heard about it, she didn't hesitate. "If my music can help even a little, I'll play," she said. The concert took place in a small but elegant hall. Families, teachers, and guests filled the seats. She was one of the youngest performers there, surrounded by professionals with years of experience. But when it was her turn, she didn't think about that. She just sat down, took a deep breath, and played. Her song was the same one she had performed at the national competition, a piece that carried her story. It started quietly like a whisper, then grew with emotion. The audience could feel every note as if they were hearing her memories come alive through the piano. When she finished, there was a long silence, followed by applause that seemed to go on forever. People stood to their feet, clapping, smiling, even wiping tears. That night, several guests came to meet her backstage. One of them was a woman who ran a music foundation. She told her, "You have something rare, a voice that reaches people without words. I would like to sponsor your lessons if you're willing to continue your studies seriously." For a moment, she couldn't speak. She had dreamed of real lessons for years, but never imagined someone would offer them for free. She finally managed to whisper, "Thank you. I'll do my best." From that day on, her life began to change again. She started taking formal piano lessons every week. Her new teacher was patient but strict. He corrected her hand positions, explained new techniques, and introduced her to pieces she had never heard before. At first, it was difficult. She had played freely all her life, without worrying about structure or theory. Now she had to unlearn some habits and start understanding the technical side of music. But she didn't give up. She stayed late after lessons, repeating the same passages over and over until her teacher smiled and said, "Yes, that's it." Months passed, and her progress amazed everyone. The small-town girl who had once played on a broken piano was now mastering classical compositions that required great skill and discipline. Her teacher often said, "Talent is one thing, but your patience and heart make the real difference." Soon, more opportunities came. She was invited to play at community events, school functions, and music festivals. People admired not just her playing, but her humility. She never tried to show off. She just played with the same quiet sincerity that had always defined her. One evening, her teacher told her about an online video competition that had gained popularity worldwide. "You should record your performance," he said. "The judges are professional musicians from around the world. Even if you don't win, many people will hear your music." The idea made her nervous. She wasn't used to cameras or recording studios, but something inside her told her to try. So one weekend, she and her teacher set up a small recording in the academy's practice room. The piano stood near a window with soft light falling across the keys. She played her own composition, a song inspired by her journey. From the first day she had touched the piano to the moment she sat there now, every note carried a memory. Her teacher recorded quietly, barely breathing so he wouldn't interrupt the sound. When the video was uploaded, she didn't think much of it. She went back to her regular practice, schoolwork, and daily routine. But within days, something surprising happened. Views began to grow, slowly at first, then rapidly. People from different countries left comments saying how deeply her music touched them. Some said it made them cry. Others said it gave them peace. Within 2 weeks, the video had thousands of views. Then one morning, her teacher called her excitedly. "Your video has been shared by a famous pianist," he said. She opened her phone and saw it. The pianist had posted her performance on his social media, writing, "This young musician plays with a heart far beyond her years." She couldn't believe it. Her parents couldn't either. The local news picked up the story again, this time calling her the girl whose piano touched the world. She began receiving invitations from music schools and organizations. Some wanted her to perform, others offered mentorships. The woman from the foundation was overjoyed and said, "See, the world always recognizes true passion." Despite all the attention, she stayed the same. She still practiced on her small piano at home, still wrote melodies late at night when everyone was asleep. Fame didn't change her love for the music. It only made her more grateful. A few months later, she was invited to perform in a live television event featuring young talents from around the country. It was her biggest stage yet, with millions of people watching. The pressure was huge, but she didn't let it overwhelm her. Before going on stage, she closed her eyes and whispered, "Just play from your heart. That's all." When she stepped under the bright lights, her fingers trembled for a second, then settled as soon as they touched the piano. The music filled the studio, calm and graceful at first, then rising with emotion. Viewers at home later said they could feel every note like a story unfolding. When she finished, the audience rose to their feet. The judges smiled, clearly moved. One of them said, "Sometimes music speaks louder than words. Tonight we heard truth." That performance went viral across social media. People shared clips, calling her the girl with the golden hands or the pianist who makes silence feel like music. Some even wrote letters saying her music helped them through hard times. But for her, the most touching moment came a few days later. She received a message from her old school teacher, the one who had first believed in her when no one else did. The message simply said, "I knew the world would hear you someday. I'm proud of you." She cried quietly while reading it, remembering the old classroom, the dusty piano, and the quiet afternoons when she played alone. Everything had started there. Her journey was far from over. New opportunities kept coming. Invitations to perform, offers to collaborate, even discussions about recording an album. But through it all, she kept reminding herself why she started. It was never about fame. It was about feeling alive through the music. Sometimes she still visited her old school. The piano there was still the same, though its paint had faded more. She would sit at it, press a few keys, and smile. "Thank you," she whispered once, as if the piano could hear her. The teacher, now older, would stand by the door and watch her with quiet pride. "You've gone far," he said once, "but don't forget, the greatest stage is not the biggest one. It's the one where you play with love. She nodded, her eyes warm. I'll never forget. That evening, she walked home under a soft golden sky, her heart light. She didn't know what the future would bring. Maybe more stages, maybe new songs, maybe moments of doubt again. But one thing was certain. Music would always guide her, the same way it had from the beginning. The girl who once played in an empty classroom had now played for the world. And somehow, she was still the same quiet, gentle soul who believed that even the simplest melody could change hearts. After the television performance, her life began to move faster than she ever imagined. One day she was sitting quietly at home, practicing her piano near the window, and the next day she was getting phone calls from music directors, teachers, and reporters. Everyone wanted to know more about the girl whose music had touched millions. At first, all the attention felt exciting. People recognized her on the street. Children from her neighborhood waved at her and said they wanted to learn piano too. Her parents were proud but also a little worried. They had always lived a simple life, and now everything around them was changing. She tried to stay calm through it all. She kept reminding herself that she hadn't started playing piano for fame or recognition. She played because music made her feel alive, but sometimes the noise around her made it hard to remember that simple truth. Not long after her television appearance, she received an invitation to perform in another country. It was part of an international youth music festival, where talented players from around the world would come together to share their art. When she read the letter, she felt her hands shake. She had never even been on an airplane before. Her teacher was thrilled. "This is an incredible opportunity," he said. "You'll meet people who live and breathe music. You'll learn things no classroom can teach." Her parents agreed, even though they worried about her traveling so far. They reminded her to stay grounded, to eat well, and to never forget where she came from. She promised them she wouldn't. When the day finally came, she stood at the airport holding her passport tightly. Everything felt new. The sounds, the crowds, the lights. When the plane took off, she looked out the window and watched her city disappear beneath the clouds. A strange mix of fear and excitement filled her heart. The festival took place in a beautiful old city known for its music. The streets were lined with theaters, small cafes, and street performers playing violins and flutes. She could hear music everywhere she went, and it made her feel both inspired and nervous. On the first day, all the participants gathered in a large hall. Some were older than her, some younger, but all of them were talented. Many had been trained since early childhood by famous teachers. She felt a little out of place among them. Some carried expensive instruments and spoke confidently about the pieces they planned to perform. When it was her turn to introduce herself, she simply said, "I learned on my own from a piano at my school." Her quiet tone made the others pause. A few smiled kindly, others looked surprised. But no one said anything. During rehearsals, she listened carefully to everyone. Each player had a unique style. Some were powerful and bold, others graceful and calm. When her turn came to practice, she sat at the piano, closed her eyes for a second, and began to play her piece. The hall fell silent. The melody was simple but filled with emotion. The same quiet strength that had once stunned the judges back home now reached this international stage. When she finished, there was a small pause before gentle applause filled the room. One of the senior musicians approached her afterward and said, "You play as if you're telling a story. Don't ever lose that." Those words stayed with her. The night of the performance arrived quickly. The audience was large, filled with teachers, parents, and musicians from many countries. The lights shone brightly on the stage, and for a moment, she felt the same nervousness she had felt the first time she ever played in front of people. But as soon as her hands touched the keys, the world faded away. She played the piece she had written herself, a song about growth, hope, and home. It began with soft, gentle notes that slowly grew into a powerful melody. People listened quietly, some leaning forward, completely still. When she finished, the hall stayed silent for several seconds, just as it had years ago during her first competition. Then came the applause, long, loud, and full of warmth. She stood and bowed, her eyes shining. After the performance, a man from a music academy approached her. He said, "We would like to offer you a place in our international program. You have a rare talent, something that can't be taught." She didn't know what to say. It was the kind of opportunity most musicians could only dream of. She returned home after the festival with a new spark inside her. She told her parents and teacher about the offer. and though they were proud, they asked her to think carefully. Studying abroad would mean leaving everything behind, her home, her friends, her school. For several days she thought deeply about it. She would walk to the park, sit on a bench, and imagine what her life might look like in another country. She also thought about her small piano at home, the one that had started everything. Could she really leave it behind? One night, while she was practicing, her father quietly entered the room. He watched her play for a moment before saying, "You don't have to rush. But remember, the world gave you a gift because you gave something beautiful to it. If your music can reach more people, don't be afraid to follow it." His words stayed in her heart. A few days later, she wrote back to the academy and accepted their offer. The next months were busy. She prepared her documents, packed her belongings, and said goodbye to her friends and teacher. On the morning of her flight, her mother hugged her tightly and whispered, "No matter how far you go, we'll always be listening to your music." Her new life began in a place where everything was different. The language, the weather, the faces. The academy was much bigger than she had imagined, filled with talented students from around the world. At first, she struggled to keep up. The lessons were faster, the teachers more demanding, and the competition stronger. Sometimes she felt lonely. She missed her home, her parents, and the quiet classroom where she used to play freely without pressure. But she reminded herself that every musician faces hard moments. She told herself, "If I can make people feel something through my music, that's enough." Slowly, she began to adjust. Her teachers noticed her progress. One of them, an older pianist known for his precision, once said, "You play with emotion, but now you are learning to control it. That balance is what makes greatness." She worked harder than ever, practicing late into the night. The sound of her piano often echoed through the quiet halls after everyone had gone home. Some students would stop outside her practice room just to listen. Over time, she started composing new pieces inspired by her experiences. The loneliness of being far from home, the beauty of new beginnings, the small moments that made life meaningful. Her compositions were soon included in academy performances, earning praise from both students and teachers. One evening, while she was practicing alone, a teacher entered quietly and said, "There's a concert next month where we want our best students to perform. Would you like to take part?" She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. The concert was held in a grand theater filled with music lovers from across the city. She performed a new piece she had written herself, a soft melody that grew into something full of strength and courage. When she finished, the audience gave her a standing ovation. A journalist who attended the concert wrote an article the next day titled, "The Girl Who Speaks Through Her Piano." The story spread again, and soon people from her home country began sending her messages of love and pride. Despite all the success, she never forgot her beginnings. She often wrote letters to her teacher back home, telling him about her progress. Sometimes she sent recordings of her new music. He always replied with kind words, reminding her to keep her heart pure and her playing honest. One evening, after a particularly long practice, she sat by the window of her dorm room, looking out at the city lights. She thought about everything that had happened, from the dusty piano in her old school to the bright stages she now performed on. It felt like a story she could hardly believe. Yet even as she sat there surrounded by the sound of city life, she realized something important. Success wasn't about trophies, fame, or big stages. It was about connection, the invisible thread between her heart and the hearts of those who listened. She decided that no matter where life took her, she would always play for that connection. Months later, she received an invitation to perform at a global youth concert, one that would be broadcast live across several countries. It would be her biggest audience yet. As she read the letter, her hands trembled, but this time not from fear. It was gratitude. When she called her parents to tell them, her mother laughed softly and said, "See, the world keeps opening its doors for you." Her father added, "Just remember, every door leads back to where you started, your music." As the date of the concert approached, she practiced harder than ever, pouring everything she had learned, felt, and lived into her new composition. It was a piece that told her entire journey, from the first hesitant note in that small classroom to the grand halls where she now played. The day of the concert, she stood backstage, her heart beating fast. She could hear the audience settling in, the hum of anticipation in the air. Before stepping out, she whispered the same words she always did. Play from your heart. When she began, the music flowed like a story. It was gentle, emotional, and powerful all at once. Every rise and fall of the melody seemed to mirror her path, her struggles, her discoveries, her growth. As the final note faded, the entire hall fell silent. Then came the sound of applause, thunderous and full of love. Cameras flashed, people stood, and she bowed deeply, feeling a wave of warmth wash over her. That night, as she returned to her room, she sat by the piano and played a soft tune, just for herself. It wasn't for the cameras or the audience. It was for the little girl who had once played in the empty classroom, dreaming quietly of music that could reach the world. After the global youth concert, her life changed again, this time in ways she never imagined. The video of her performance spread across the internet within days. People shared it on every platform, calling her the pianist who played from the heart. Music teachers used her story to inspire their students, and schools invited her to talk about her journey. But even as the world talked about her, she stayed quiet and humble. She didn't chase interviews or attention. Instead, she spent most of her time composing new music, practicing alone, or teaching children who wanted to learn piano. Fame never made her proud or distant. She didn't want to live like a celebrity. She wanted to live like an artist, someone who created something meaningful, something that could touch souls. In the months that followed, she was invited to perform in several cities. Each place had its own energy, its own stories, and its own people who connected to her music. She traveled from one hall to another, sometimes performing for large crowds, sometimes in small, quiet gatherings where people listened with closed eyes. Her music carried a message that no dream was too small and no beginning too humble. Wherever she played, she shared that message softly, not with speeches, but through her notes. But after so many travels, so many faces, she began to feel something she hadn't felt in years: homesickness. She missed her parents, her old school, her teacher, and even the sound of the broken piano that had started it all. She missed the smell of her home, the narrow streets of her town, and the feeling of belonging to a small place where everyone knew her story. So one day, after finishing a concert abroad, she made a decision. She told her manager she wanted to take a break, not for weeks, but for a few months. "I need to go home," she said quietly. When she arrived back in her hometown, everything felt smaller than she remembered, but warmer too. The streets, the shops, the familiar faces, they all made her heart feel light again. Her parents were waiting at the door when she reached home. They hugged her like they hadn't seen her in years. Her mother wiped tears from her eyes and said, "You're still the same, my child. That's what I prayed for." That evening, after dinner, she sat at her old piano. It still had the same scratches and missing keys. Dust had gathered on its corners, but to her it was beautiful. She pressed a key gently, and the sound filled the room, slightly off tune but comforting, like the voice of an old friend. Her father stood nearby and said, "This piano waited for you." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "It never left me," she replied. For hours that night she played, not for an audience, not for cameras, but just for herself. The melody she created wasn't planned. It came from deep inside, a mix of everything she had lived through, her struggles, her fears, her victories, and her endless gratitude. As she played, her mother sat silently in the next room, listening. She later said that the house had never sounded so alive. The next morning, she decided to visit her old school. It was still standing, though many things had changed. The hallways were freshly painted and new students filled the classrooms. But when she walked into the old music room, her steps slowed. The same broken piano still stood there, covered with a thin white cloth. She walked closer, lifted the cloth gently, and touched the keys. They were dusty but familiar. Her heart filled with memories. Those quiet afternoons after class, the sound of her first tune, the day she was told to play the easiest piece, and how everything had begun right there. As she sat on the same wooden bench, the school's new music teacher entered. At first, he didn't recognize her. But when he saw her hands resting on the piano, he froze. "Wait, are you?" She smiled softly and nodded. Yes, this is where it all started. The teacher couldn't hide his excitement. He called the students from the hallway and told them, You're looking at one of our most inspiring alumni. She once played on this very piano, and now her music is known around the world. The children's eyes widened. They gathered around her, full of curiosity and admiration. One of them asked shyly, "Can you play something for us?" She hesitated for a moment, then said, "All right, but only if you promise to listen carefully and not you." So with your ears but with your heart, she began to play. The piano was old and out of tune, but somehow the melody sounded perfect in that room. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was gentle, filled with emotion. The children sat quietly, completely mesmerized. When she finished, there was silence, the same kind of silence that had followed her first competition years ago. Then the students clapped, their small hands filling the room with joy. One of the girls walked up to her and said, "I want to play piano like you one day." She smiled and replied softly, "Then start now." Every big journey begins with a single note. That day she donated her old music sheets to the school. She also offered to sponsor lessons for a few students each year who couldn't afford them. She told the principal, "Someone once gave me a chance when I had nothing. I want to do the same for others." Her story spread again, but this time she didn't care about the attention. She felt at peace knowing she could give something back to the place that had given her everything. In the weeks that followed, she spent her days quietly, helping her parents with small chores. Walking in the park, writing new melodies in her notebook. She felt more grounded than ever. She realized that success didn't mean always moving forward. Sometimes it meant coming home and remembering who you truly were. One evening, she sat with her teacher from the old days. He was older now, his hair gray, his hands trembling slightly, but his eyes still sharp and kind. They talked for hours about music, about how life had changed, and about the strange way time passes. Before she left, he said something she would never forget. "You have played on the biggest stages," he said, "but remember this. The greatest music isn't made for applause. It's made for understanding, for healing, for love. You have that gift. Never lose it." She held his hand and said softly, "I won't." After that meeting, she went back home and began working on a new piece. It was different from anything she had written before. Simple, calm, full of emotion. It was a reflection of everything she had learned about life and music. When she finally played it for her parents, they both sat silently, listening with tears in their eyes. Her father said, "This one feels like home." She smiled. "That's because it is," she said. Later, she decided to record that piece and dedicate it to her hometown. She titled it "The First Note." When she shared it online, it quickly became one of her most loved compositions. People from around the world commented, saying it made them feel peace, nostalgia, and hope. One person wrote, "It feels like this music understands my heart." Another said, "I can hear her journey in every note." Reading those messages made her realize something. Even though she had started in a small corner of the world, her music had reached places she had never seen, people she had never met, and somehow they all felt connected through the sound of her piano. A few months later, she was invited again to perform at a grand concert, this time as a special guest. The same judge who had been at her very first competition was also attending. When he saw her name on the list, he smiled and said, "I remember that quiet girl who once turned silence into music." During the concert, she played the first note. The lights dimmed and the audience grew still. As her fingers moved across the keys, she thought about everything: the dusty classroom, the laughter of her classmates, the advice of her teacher, the love of her parents, and the journey that had brought her there. When the last note faded, there was no sound, not even a whisper. Then, just like before, the hall erupted in applause. Some people stood clapping with tears in their eyes. The judge, sitting in the front row, leaned forward and said softly, "Genius doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through music." That night after the concert, she didn't go to any celebrations or interviews. She simply walked outside where the city lights glowed softly and took a quiet walk alone. The cool breeze brushed against her face and she felt peaceful, completely at ease. She knew her journey wasn't over. There would be new stages, new challenges, and new melodies waiting to be written, but she also knew she would always carry her roots within her. Back at home, the old piano waited. Some nights, when she couldn't sleep, she would sit down and play for hours, not to practice, not to impress, but simply because it made her feel human. And every time she pressed a key, She remembered that shy girl who had once been told to play the easiest piece, and how, in her own quiet way, she had turned that moment into a lifetime of music that touched the world.